Thanks everyone for joining us today. We are excited to have our Utah Rape Recovery here joining us, and they're going to be presenting all about consent. I'm going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves, and we are good to get started. So thank you for being here.
Okay, perfect. Hi everyone. My name is Kiva, and I am the prevention intern at the Rape Recovery Center. We also have Sam here today, who is our prevention coordinator. So they kind of just lead everything on the prevention team and do a lot of really cool work. Yeah, and we're super, super excited to be here with you. I am going to start sharing my screen here. Okay. Okay, it's giving me a hard time now. So would it actually be possible for you to share the screen? Sorry. It's saying that I
Yes,
don't have
absolutely.
permissions. I don't know what's going on with that,
That's
but
totally okay.
thank you so much. I appreciate your flexibility.
Okay, there you go. You should be seeing my screen, yes?
It is loading on my end. There we go. Okay, now it's loaded. Perfect. Um, All right, so today we are going to be talking about consent culture in the family and how to kind of teach consent and just kind of understanding ways to build healthy mindsets around consent in the family culture. If you have any questions during this presentation, please don't hesitate to write them in the chat and Sam will respond. We want to make sure that this is a discussion-based format if possible. So feel free to like speak up and respond to any questions that we ask. Um, we would also like to mention that we are working with a research-based theoretical approach. I am not a parent, so I just want to make sure that this conversation is open to everyone, and that you as the parents can provide input and experience, because I think that will really benefit the experience for everyone. Um, is there a chat? And yes, there is. Okay, I've never used this video format before, so I'm learning. But I believe there was a pre-test survey that was sent out yesterday. Um, is that true? Did that get sent out?
I was just actually gonna throw it in the chat right now,
Oh,
if that's
perfect. No
okay.
worries.
Sometimes we have a hard time when we send things out beforehand.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is perfect. I think Sam might have also just uploaded it. Um, So no worries about having to add the link there. This is just kind of a pre-test survey that we send out for all of our workshops that help us kind of better understand how well our workshops are working. So that would be great if everyone could take a moment to fill that out. It's just a few questions. Yeah, and with that, we can get started. And we can go to the next slide. Perfect. All right. So, for some context, I just want to go over what our mission at the Rape Recovery Center is. At the RRC, we empower survivors of sexual violence through advocacy, crisis intervention, and therapy. We also do workshops like this to help educate the community about the cause, impact, and prevention of sexual violence. We can go to the next slide. Just for an overview of what we'll be talking about today, we are going to just kind of get an overview of what consent is and how to understand consent culture. And then from there, we will kind of jump into how this can be applied to a parenting setting. All right. So to start off, I just want to open up the discussion to everyone and just ask if anyone has any um, comments that they would like to share about how you usually teach consent or think about consent when parenting. You can unmute yourself and speak that way. You could type into the chat, whatever is best for you. And as previously mentioned, I just want to reiterate that we want to really center your voices on this topic. And yeah, just get everyone's input if possible. Your body, your choice, including with family. Absolutely. Your body, your choice is something we're going to talk about a little bit later on in this discussion. It's such a important phrase to keep in mind when teaching consent. So thank you for sharing. Any other thoughts?
I think for me, I have little boys at home, and this is something that we've always tried to teach from the time they were little, right? This idea of consent and getting permission to touch other people's bodies as and so I think for us, it's as parents, we've really tried to ensure that we're talking them through things, right? Even at a young age of, hey, you're going to the bathroom, so we're going to help you, wipe your bottom or things like that, where we're asking and talking through it and helping them understand, right? Especially when they're younger, who's allowed to touch and what safe touch is, and that kind of thing. So I think it starts when we're really young, um, and teaching our kids at an appropriate age, starting from the time they're little.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. That is an excellent point that we're going to be talking about at various points throughout this presentation of how important it is to start these conversations early and to really frame them in various contexts, as you mentioned. Like, consent is not just about certain types of touch. It can be something as simple as a hug or helping them clean up after themselves. So, thank you so much for sharing. Looks like we have a few more responses in the chat as well. Heather says, getting on the same page of comfortable relationship dynamics, especially in a physical sense. Absolutely. Erica says, boundaries, no touching others without permission, even if you want to give a hug, get permission. Absolutely. And then you have a 5-year-old who says, my body, my choice, and my body doesn't want to take the garbage out. It can be, there's some drawbacks there. Sometimes they're too smart for their own good. Amazing. Well, thank you everyone for your input on that. I think we can go on to the next slide now. All right. So to talk about consent, we use the Fries model. It's been used by various organizations. We didn't come up with it. And it's just such a helpful way to remember the various aspects of consent. So as they're listed here, we start with freely given, and that means that consent should not be given without pressure, manipulation, or influence. Consent must be reversible. This means that anyone can change their mind at any time. Just because someone agreed before doesn't mean that they have to now. Informed consent is that everyone should have all the necessary information before saying yes. There's no lies, no deception. Everything is just all out on the table. And then it's also super important that consent is enthusiastic. This means consent is an excited yes. It's not like a reluctant, I guess so, or silence. Um, Consent should also be specific, and this means that saying yes to one thing doesn't mean that you are saying yes to everything. Consent is all about having these clear boundaries and respecting these boundaries. Um, so I think this is a super helpful framework to kind of think about how many ways consent is nuanced. So does anyone have any specific examples using this Fry model of how this can look? This can be in ultimately any context. It can be in a parenting context, a relationship context, a work context. I think it's super helpful to kind of think about consent in various aspects, and it helps us kind of conceptualize it. Yes, Ashley says, love the tea example. That is one of the resources that gets like the most response from participants in the workshops. Everyone seems to really, really love it.
I think for me, a big part of the Fries model is like moving away from, um, these slogans that I think used to be pretty popular, like no means no, where we're not talking about the value of a yes, or we're not talking about as much when people say yes under pressure or because they think they have to. And so this was, when I learned about this model, I think it was really helpful to kind of, uh, really open my mind to the ways that consent can be really tricky. And I'm sure that's something we'll get into more, but just wanted to add that.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's super helpful for kind of understanding the nuance and, yeah, just understanding consent as a whole. Thank you, Sam. Any last thoughts on this section?
I love the importance of like the reversible, right? That you can change your mind at any time. I think especially as we're raising young ones or even right into teenagers, the ability to say, "Oh, I wanted that hug, but now I'm done." Right? And the
Mm,
respect that needs to be given when it's no longer wanted.
absolutely. All right, it looks like we have a few more comments in the chat as well. Helpful for peer pressure in any situation, not just physical. Absolutely. Ashley, that sounds like a super important role. Cassidy says she likes the specific part just because you're consenting to one thing. Yep, absolutely. It's a super helpful model. All right, well, I think we can move on to the next. Um, all right. For the sake of time, I don't think that we will be watching this video just so we make sure that we have time for discussion. But I will make sure to send a link, and then that can be distributed with maybe our post-test survey. It's a super incredible resource to kind of just conceptualize the Fries model. We do a lot of workshops with teens and at various schools, and people seem to really respond to this resource. So yeah, it's a great one. We'll be sure to send that one out. All right. And one thing that we really like to talk about when we outline consent is that coercion is not consent. So this kind of speaks to the Fries model a bit, but to provide a little bit more information, coercion is the threat of pressuring, threatening, manipulating, or forcing someone into doing something against their will, something that they are not comfortable with, and it removes the person's ability to feel like they can freely choose. Um, and just a general rule is you cannot truly consent while being coerced. So we can move on to the next slide to just kind of talk about some specific ways that coercion can occur. This can include persuasion, pressure, guilt, blackmail, threats, lots of different examples of how this can show up. And yeah, it's just a super important thing to keep in mind because I think similar to what Sam was mentioning before, a lot of the kind of older kind of like catchphrases to speak about consent don't really speak to how common coercion actually is in various contexts. All right, and we can move on to the next. Some other unhealthy dynamics that can occur are relationships involving positions of power. So some examples of this can be student and teacher. That's one that is talked about pretty often. So that just, there's, an unequal dynamic in that situation where someone may feel coerced and pressured to consent to something. If someone is incapacitated or under the influence, they cannot fully consent. Utah also has a specific law about this. Various states have different approaches, but in Utah, you cannot consent while incapacitated or under the influence. Yeah, and then of course just vulnerable populations. So this is about like working with kids specifically. An important thing to keep in mind that consent is kids are not able to give consent in the same way that adults can. Does anyone have any questions? I know that this is a really kind of tricky area sometimes. There can be a lot of questions that parents have around these dynamics. Does anyone have any questions about this? No worries if not. All right, we can move on to the next. And if any questions come up, again, please feel free to write them in the chat or save them for the end, or just unmute and ask. No worries. All right. So if you're here in this workshop, you've probably had some thoughts about consent and just wanting to bring it up to kids, people in your life in general. Um, and you've probably run into the situation where it's kind of hard to teach consent, especially to kids. It's a super nuanced concept, and it can just be difficult to explain such a complex thing to folks who don't have as much life experience. So before we get into some specific examples that we have listed, I just want to ask if anyone has had any experiences where teaching consent has felt difficult or reasons that you were concerned about teaching consent. I also know that the discussion-based format is a little tricky with a virtual workshop, so thank you all for bearing with us. Uncomfortable for parents to talk about that. Yeah, thank you, Erica. Definitely. There is definitely a lot of potential awkwardness around consent, specifically if we're talking about consent in sexual contexts. Um, yes, that is a really great point. Does anyone have anything to add to that or anything in addition?
I think for me, it's the battling of um culture, right? I said I have four boys, and there's been so many times that I've heard, oh, the boys will be boys, and trying to fight that kind of languaging and well, no, right? Like there's still respect, there's still consent, they need to be taught differently, and I'm not going to brush that aside. So, right, I can teach it in my home, but I can't control what language and challenges are being brought to them outside of the house, right, with school and with friends. And so I think that makes teaching consent difficult as well.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you so much for sharing. We have a few more responses in the chat as well. Ashley says, challenge to bring it up in relation to close caregivers. Absolutely. Sometimes being within certain relationship dynamics and certain closeness makes it really, really difficult to have these conversations. Challenge lies with the caregivers feeling offended or defensive. Absolutely. Need to be ready to have an honest discussion about sexuality with your children. Yes, and that can definitely be a difficult thing. Particularly in areas where sexual abstinence is taught as a value, it can definitely be difficult to kind of have those conversations when that is the social norm. Heather says, I have both boys and girls, and I am not sure how to approach teaching consent to both genders. Yes, that is definitely challenging. I think Sam definitely has more experience with that than I do. I am pretty new to the prevention scene, but I want to do some more research on that. Have a hard time on how to ask if neighbors and family members have done or said something uncomfortable. Absolutely. I think that's another great point too, which we'll kind of get into later in the presentation. But one thing that is really common is just having a hard time, like a child having a hard time expressing that something made them uncomfortable because maybe it's normalized that they have to give a hug without someone asking or something like that, where they don't necessarily know how to express the discomfort that they feel. All right, amazing. Everyone is giving really great examples. If we go to the next slide, we have just a list that's pretty similar to what everyone has been mentioning. So yeah, we can, perfect. So again, pretty similar to the conversations that have been happening in our discussion here, but there's the potential for awkwardness. It can be difficult to know what topics are age appropriate, and we'll kind of get into this a little bit later. It can be difficult to know how to introduce the topic. And again, cultures of sexual abstinence can make these conversations a little bit more difficult. It can also feel hard to teach consent, when there's a disconnect between words and actions. So there's so much nuance in consent that it looks a little bit different for everyone, right? So you might have a spouse who like holds your hand without asking, and that's totally fine if that's what you're comfortable with. And that can be a hard thing to kind of express to a child, that there can be nuance in that while still teaching them the basics of consent. Yeah, so seeing this list, does anyone have any comments before we move on? I think, like I said, I think we kind of mentioned each of these in our discussion in the chat, and yeah, so I think we're pretty good. Ashley says, wanting to rub a child's back or tickle while cuddling, I now ask. Absolutely. That is a really good practice to make sure to ask in those situations. Perfect. All right. So now we want to get into the nuance of consent culture as a concept. So has anyone heard the phrase consent culture before? I feel like it's talked about a little bit more now than it used to be, but it still is a pretty new concept in the mainstream. So if we go to the next slide, we can kind of define it a bit. So at its core, consent culture is the opposite of rape culture. It allows for everyone to be empowered to talk about what their boundaries are, what they're comfortable with. It allows a space where when assault does happen, we can believe survivors and support survivors. It's also super important to recognize that consent culture goes just beyond sexual behavior. It can be expanded to everything in life. It is an everyday practice for everyone. It's also super important to think about how we can break taboos about consent, kind of like what we were mentioning in the chat about how it's not normalized to ask before tickling or hugging. And yeah, so just breaking down those taboos are super helpful in addressing consent. We have some specific examples of what this can look like. So for example, physical touch, this can be asking, can I give you a hug? Handling belongings, you can ask if it's okay if you handle their backpack or their phone, whatever it is. Emotional intimacy is a big one as well that I think a lot of people don't necessarily associate with consent, but it's super important to just make sure that you are respecting someone's capacity and making sure that in a parenting context, you're letting your kids know that, hey, if you feel like you cannot offer this emotional support to a friend, it's totally okay to say that. Like, you don't have to feel obligated. On the flip side, it's also important to let kids know that there's no pressure to talk about what they're going through immediately. Sometimes it's important for kids to approach you. Also super important to talk about disclosure and just make sure that everyone is okay with the information that you are sharing. So these are just a few examples, but I would love to hear if anyone else has any other thoughts or has any other examples of how consent culture has sounded in their own life. I can kind of give an example, not specific to parenting, but my roommate and I are in school together, and some days, being in school, it's just super exhausting, a lot emotionally. And so if we feel like we need to talk about something that happened in a class or a project that we're stressed about, we will ask each other, like, do you have the capacity to listen right now? Like, is it okay if I talk about what's going on. And I think that's a great way to really respect each other's boundaries. Ashley says in the chat, I've had to has helped with this. Yeah. Any other examples, thoughts, questions on this topic? All right. With toddlers and when they are being physical with one another, I will say I can see you're having a hard time controlling your hands, so I'm going to pick you up and move you so you do not hurt blank. Absolutely, yeah. I think that speaks to the informed consent and specific consent aspect of the Fries model. Yeah, I think that's a really great practice. All right. We can go on to our next section. So this is the main event of today's workshop. We're going to be talking about how to apply the concepts that we were all just talking about to the practical setting of being a parent and just seeing how these concepts can be used in real life. So this is a great TED Talk I recommend to everyone. I will again send a link with the post-test survey for this. There are a few points that Monica Rivera makes in this video that I think are super, super important. First of all, one thing that she mentions is avoiding the talk, which I think this can be kind of a strange way to think about this for some people because the talk is seen as such a almost like coming of age experience, a necessary part of growing up. But Rivera actually frames this as when we incorporate consent culture into our everyday life, the talk is not this big scary thing anymore. It's just there's already this understanding of consent in everyday life, and therefore it can be easier to connect the concept to sexual behavior. It's also important that we, when having conversations with kids, we focus our conversations on consent and autonomy in various contexts. So just making sure that everyone knows that they have the right to their own body, that they have the right to make boundaries around their own body, and that the bare minimum is for people to respect that. Again, it's super important to kind of demystify this idea of consent being only about sexual behavior and instead talk about how it is related to everyday life. To mention a term or a phrase that was brought up earlier, Rivera also talks about your body, your choice. Again, this is emphasizing bodily autonomy in kids. And this can mean a lot of different things. This can be examples like, do you want me to put on your socks or do you want to put them on? Do you want apples or crackers for lunch today? Or not for lunch, but as a snack. Do you want to give grandma a hug or a high five? And this allows kids to really understand that they have ownership over their own body. And it helps you just kind of allow them to be comfortable creating those boundaries and speaking their mind, which again will just continue to make consent an easier conversation and topic in the future. One thing that I think can definitely kind of similar to what we talked about earlier with saying my body, my choice, and my body doesn't want to take the trash out today. This can be tricky because sometimes you do have to balance your expectations as a parent with their decisions. Because of course, like, again, boundaries are important. You have to set boundaries with your kids as well. And sometimes it can be stressful thinking that you might watch them make the wrong choice, or you might be concerned that setting those boundaries might make them feel like they don't have that autonomy. So, I mean, this is individual to everyone, but there's a lot of really creative ways to kind of balance this. For example, in the context of if you want apples or broccoli for a snack, if you have apples today, then we'll have broccoli tomorrow. So it's still allowing for that decision process to happen, and that autonomy to happen, but also setting those clear expectations and boundaries as a parent. Does anyone have any thoughts about that? I know that was kind of like a hefty, um, kind of deep dive into the your body, your choice aspect. Any thoughts on that? Perfect. Um, Another thing mentioned in this TED Talk is there is a way to honor no. Like, no doesn't have to be this big, scary thing. I think a lot of times we are socialized to think of saying no as a bad thing or socialized to fear rejection. Um, and Rivera talks about how it can actually be so beneficial to reframe no as just something that happens. Sometimes you just say no, and that's totally fine. No doesn't have to be paired with anger. And a way that this can show up in a parenting example um, is if you are saying no and you just simply say it as, no, I don't think so, or no, I'm not comfortable with that. And it doesn't have to be a big event. It can just be simply saying no with a normal tone of voice. And yeah. All right, Heather says, we talk about the power of stop. If, say, we are tickling or forget to ask beforehand, if anything becomes too much or they always change their mind, they can say stop and we stop immediately. That is in their power. Absolutely. Pointed this out when I observed physical play without consent. I've asked, do you want them to tackle you, pick you up, etc.? How do you feel when they do that? How do you know you can tell them put me down or stop too? Absolutely. That's super important. And I think you also touch on a super important aspect of being open to having these conversations and asking these questions. When it is a safe environment in a family to ask questions, and that is being modeled by parents, kids will have a lot easier time throughout their life to ask questions and clarify. Absolutely. Thank you for the input, Heather. All right. So on this slide, we're going to talk about consent vocabulary, which is another thing that Rivera talks about in her TED Talk. And this is kind of the concept of body literacy. And this is just kind of some frameworks that childhood psychologists have recommended based on research. Because again, as we mentioned previously, it can be difficult to find the correct terminology for various aspects of or various groups of ages. Um, so research has found that early childhood, the best way to frame conversations about consent is in the terms of body, space, and touch. So kind of exactly what we've been talking about in the chat of just framing the idea of physical space and autonomy and yeah, just kind of introducing those topics. In elementary school, you can kind of move into boundaries, kind of talking about what boundaries are. Um, at this point, you've already been using the idea of boundaries in early childhood, but you can kind of put the language to it and help children conceptualize it a little bit more. And also can start teaching nonverbal cues. So helping kids understand how to read body language and how to not only react to other people's body language, but to notice their own and recognize what certain feelings might show up as. In middle school, can kind of move into the language around romance, sexual harassment, and discomfort and advocacy. So kind of getting into a little bit more specific of examples of how consent culture can show up in intimate relationships. And also just, again, kind of expanding upon in elementary school those nonverbal cues of, oh, I feel uncomfortable right now. How can I address this? And then in high school can kind of move into the concepts of sexual activity and substance use and have open conversations about those that are built on having conversations about consent throughout the rest of the developmental periods. So again, this is not like a foolproof guide. This is just what child psychologists often recommend, but everyone's experiences are different. And so yeah, it just provides a little bit of some guidelines. And And we can go to the next slide. So this keeps coming up. I think it's just a super important concept in consent culture. As role models, you really you have an opportunity to model healthy behaviors. Um, this can show as practicing consent communication with everyone. This is in the family unit, could be with a spouse, with other um, children, with friends, just really showing that it's okay and it's normal and it's healthy to ask questions and set boundaries. Again, no does not have to be scary, bad, or punitive, as we mentioned. And setting boundaries is what everyone does, like in various contexts. And I think there can be a lot of really intense feelings around the word boundaries. And so helping kids frame it as something that is very normal is super beneficial. All right, Kirsten says, I feel like some of these concepts need introduced even earlier than that guideline. Kids are learning more at a younger age. Absolutely. Yeah, and Sam mentions this is also, especially with kids being so online, absolutely. I think it's super important to think about how the digital world really shapes culture around this. And it's super important to kind of keep in mind. Yeah. Does anyone have some examples of like at a younger age, how kids can kind of be presented with this information? Even if your kids aren't online, their friends probably are. Absolutely. Yeah, I wonder if there are like specific ways that we can think about incorporating these kind of guidelines um, at various ages. There are a lot of good kids books with illustrations. Absolutely. I think that's such an important way to approach this. I am a psychology student, so I learn about a lot about like methods of socialization. And media is such a major part of that, whether that's online or physical books, and it can be such a helpful tool for teaching these topics.
Can I add something?
Of course.
So yeah, I just because this is coming up in the chat, kids being exposed to a lot more at earlier ages. I think this modeling piece is even more important to kind of show, um, I don't know, just to show the sort of differences between, real life and media. And so yeah, like Erica just said, maybe using TV shows to explain. We did a whole workshop on for parents and caregivers on communication and how you sort of bring up some of these difficult topics. And I don't know, maybe you sort of select a few pieces of media that you want to show your child, and kind of with the covert mission of like, oh, I'm going to pause it at this point and ask about, did they get consent, that sort of thing. Um, and yeah, so it can kind of relate more to the things that they're relating to. Um, Something else with modeling is like even things that, and this came up earlier that Kiva mentioned, when I'm with my partner and we're with our nephew, um, or our niece who's even younger, um, there's a lot more consent communication that happens in front of the kids than happens necessarily when we're just together by ourselves, right? Whether that's like a certain kind of touch or asking, if I can uh, have some of my partner's food, or just simple things like that. So like, kind of having those conversations with the other people in your life, especially other people in a caregiving capacity, and outside of those contexts where kids are involved, and saying, "Hey, when there are kids here, like I'm going to be asking a lot more, and this is why," and modeling that can help a lot. Um, yeah, I think I have some other thoughts about some of this stuff about kids being online and all of that, but maybe I'll jump back in at the end. Just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, I think that is a super great example of modeling. Thank you. Just keeping an eye on the chat. Yep. Kids' books, TV shows, it doesn't have to be a lecture. Absolutely. It can just be incorporated into everyday conversation. Absolutely. Um, so another thing that Rivera mentions in her TED Talk is this concept of don't raise kids, raise adults. She specifically talks about an experience where she was with parents, and the kids were all roughhousing, and there was just mention of like boys will be boys, kind of like I think it was Kirsten mentioned that phrase being used pretty often. And she brings up that like yes, there are aspects of childhood that are about learning and that kind of like rough play and experiencing trial and error. But you're also raising your kids to be adults someday. They're not going to be kids forever. And so it's important to teach kids accordingly and socialize them to be prepared to interact as adults. Um, yeah, I think this is like such a great little kind of tagline or phrase to keep in mind. Um, excuse me. All right. So after we've kind of talked about some specific examples of how to incorporate consent culture into your parenting style, I'm just curious to know if anyone has any concerns, questions, or if things are coming up that you would like to add to, experiences you would like to share. It would be just a great time to kind of get into some discussion.
I'm gonna jump back in super quick, and just add something to the body literacy piece, which I uh, forgot to put on the slide. But with body literacy, a lot of experts will recommend actually using anatomically correct language for body parts at as early an age as possible. So, like, not using euphemisms for genitals, and saying, teaching your child to use the words penis, vagina, things like that, to sort of prepare them. Um, Again, just like getting kids used to the idea that these are things that it's normal to talk about in certain contexts. Because I know for me and for probably a lot of us, if you find yourself in a context where you have to use those words, or use that specific communication, it's a lot harder if it's something that you're not comfortable talking about. So that's another piece of the body literacy, right? Is like, um, knowing what your body parts are called, but also being able to talk about, and I'm going back up in the chat here, um, like, how does it feel when blank, right? When you're touched in this way, or how does it feel, um, I don't know, when you haven't slept, like naming body sensations, right? Or how do you feel in this part of your body when you're angry? And all of that, I think, kind of lays the groundwork uh, for being able to talk about things that make you uncomfortable, for being able to be sensitive to those things in your own body, for being able to name sensations and feelings and um, situations that maybe are bringing up some of those feelings. So, especially and I mean, I think we see this particularly with people socialized as boys and men. Um, kind of a lot of people really struggle to identify and name sensations in their body, and that can be a huge barrier to consent later on. So that's another thing. And then the last piece that I wanted to add, um, Dr. Rivera talks about this in her talk, but like going along with the idea of making no fun, there's a few examples of that she gives where there's like a robot no, where they're like, saying no and miming a robot, right? Or a slow motion no, right? I saw some comments in the chat about tickling, and sometimes people will be tickled and say no, stop, but they actually want it, right? And so it's okay to start teaching those nuances early, but taking the no seriously, and then turning it into a game, right? Or making it fun by saying, by maybe going slow mo, right? And saying, do you actually want this? Are you okay? um, and I don't know, there's just kind of some examples. I definitely she does a much better job of explaining it, but that's one thing that really stood out to me from that. And the idea of like making, I don't know, yeah, just kind of incorporating play into the idea of rejection, to really kind of start to root out this idea we have that rejection is always this really awful thing. Those are just some things.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think that's also I appreciate you bringing that up because I think it also really illustrates, particularly the incorporating play into saying no. It really emphasizes how these concepts that feel super complex and are super complex can be made so accessible and just be incorporated into everyday life in such a helpful way. Um, so thank you, Sam. We have a few more things in the chat here. Kirsten says, my son's friend, 7, came home from school telling about a dream his friend told him on the playground, which was a very explicit dream. And while we have had healthy conversations around the body and consent, I was unprepared for kindergartners and first graders to be having those conversations on the playground. Absolutely. Yeah. I think this maybe can also tie into what we were talking about earlier with like online accessibility and kids just being exposed to various things much younger because of online access. Erica says, praise your kids when they make the right choices and also their friends. My son has a friend that always calls him when he does something wrong. I tell my friend that is a good friend you want to keep. Yes, that like healthy communication and friendship is super, super important. All right. Heather says, how do you teach no as a good/neutral thing to young children? Any more phrases like did you know or different would be awesome. Um, I think, Sam, do you have any potential
Yeah.
things to add to that?
Just kind of in addition to saying no, like kind of incorporating that into play, I think that's a great place to start. But the other thing with teaching no as like a good or neutral thing, um, I mean, something that I'm teaching my teens that within the teen programs I run, um, is we're trying to really unpack how no strengthens relationships by I don't know. I think this goes along with the idea of boundaries as like putting walls in between people or weakening relationships. And so connecting no to boundaries and then showing how boundaries are actually a way to strengthen relationships can be a really helpful thing. So sometimes, if they have obviously at an age appropriate level, right? But um, if I'm saying no to something, like if my nephew wants to um, oh, what's a good example? I don't know if my nephew wants to tickle me, right? Maybe I'll say, um, well, if you tickled me, I probably wouldn't be having very much fun, right? And I want to have fun with you right now, right? And again, starting to really build that empathy in a sense, but also saying, hey, if we were to, what were to happen if I said no and you still did this? It wouldn't be fun for me, and then it probably would end up not being fun for you. And I mean, that can be one way to open that conversation. Sometimes that's probably good for kids maybe above, you know, 6 or 7, I think, maybe a little bit younger. But like that's just kind of one example. I think I'm trying to think of another example, but those are kind of the two tips I have there. And then to the second question, any more phrases like, did you do anything new or different? I mean, a lot of this comes from our workshop on communication, which we can absolutely come back and do. But really keeping your questions open-ended can be really helpful. And I really love what Deborah is saying as well, right? Her daughter, your best friend's mother, wasn't didn't realize that her daughter wasn't sleeping, was overeating, right? So a lot of these red flags that we see, um, or a lot of the warning signs of abuse, are things that are kind of maybe can be opening points, right, into more information. And so asking open-ended questions such as like, how did you sleep? Or if there's if a child is more socially withdrawn, right? Um, Asking like, how are your friends lately, right? Or how do you feel about having a play date, right? And then just kind of getting those feelings out in the open first. It's kind of like we were saying earlier, right? Being able to name your feelings and sensations is a huge first step, because a lot of the time, and I've talked to parents about this as well. Like a lot of the time when there's abuse happening, especially sexual abuse, uh, kids will know that something is like different or weird or odd or even wrong, but not necessarily identify those feelings with discomfort or stress or taboo or whatever it is, right? So I mean, the general advice that I have is uh, open-ended questions. Is why I really like, what did you do that was new, or did you do anything different, or you know, uh, what's something you learned, or what's tell me something about this other person. Right? Tell me something about Aunt Mary, or tell me something about your friend Jeff, whatever. So it shows you're invested in their relationships, but also gives them the chance to say, "Oh yeah, like you know, Aunt Mary touched me here," or something. Right? It's obviously not always going to come up in that way, but these are kind of some of the places that I'm coming from.
Thank you, Sam. Um, yeah, I think that was such a great response. Um, Ashley says, love that example. Absolutely. Rejection is a strong feeling that prompts some intense, inappropriate responses. So starting to explain why I might not want to tickle or play right now. Obviously, there isn't always a need to explain, but teaching the nuance is helpful. Absolutely. Amazing. All right, any more thoughts on this? Also, if there are more questions that anyone has, but do not want to like put in the chat or unmute to talk about it on our post-test survey, we do have a section for additional questions and comments. Those surveys are anonymous, but we can send our responses to those to Kirsten and she can send them out to everyone. If that's okay with Kirsten. So if anyone has any other questions that they don't want to bring up now, that is a great opportunity to ask is on the survey. So before we wrap up, I just kind of want to talk about a few opportunities that we have through the Rape Recovery Center. So Sam runs the Peer Advocacy Council, and sometimes I jump in to support. This is an extracurricular group for high schoolers in Salt Lake County. It just provides opportunities to talk about things like consent culture, how to be a leader in the community, how to identify and cultivate healthy relationships, various things about this, kind of creating a environment for safe conversation and yeah, just building community. So if anyone has any teens in their life that might be interested in this, this is a great opportunity. And it's really fun. We always have great discussions and do fun activities. So um, yeah, I will also if anyone needs the QR code in another form, we can send it through email, but also on the screen here. And then on the next slide, we kind of just outline the rape recovery services in general. So we provide advocacy, and this is for various contexts as long as it is sexual assault related. So as it states here, it can be related to immigration, financial, physical, mental health, any of those things. We also offer help with navigating the legal system, crime victims reparations, and we also have support groups in both English and Spanish. We also have the PREA program, which is the Prison Rape Elimination Act program. And so that is a really, really great service for incarcerated survivors. Sam and I are on the community engagement team, so we go out into the community and do workshops like this. We do outreach and awareness. We do lots of stuff on our social media. So that's Rape Recovery Center on Instagram and all the other medias. And the Peer Advocacy Council, as I mentioned. Our mobile response team provides forensic exam accompaniment, which is such a great resource. This is when a code R is called in, which is when someone is in the hospital after experiencing an assault. Our advocates will go out and provide emotional support, clothing, blankets, resources, just advocate for those folks. We also have counseling as an option through the RRC. I believe it is up to 25 free therapy sessions for folks who are uninsured, last I heard. So that's really great. There's individual therapy and therapy groups and support groups. So lots of really great resources. We're located in Sugar House, pretty central area. Yeah, and yeah, that's about everything. Thank you so much for being part of our discussion and listening in. We really appreciate you all being here.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful and I think just invaluable to us. And I'm excited that we have it recorded and can share it with those who were unable to join. I will send out that post survey. It also looks like Sam just threw it in the chat, but I will send it via email to everyone who participated today. And yes, thank you so much for joining. I'll be on for a little bit longer if you have any additional questions or comments. But other than that, thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your guys' day.
Thank you again for giving us the opportunity to be here. It's so fun to like do community workshops and just make those connections.
No, thank you so much for presenting. You did a wonderful job.
Thank you. I'm used to the high school workshops, so I'm a little bit like I'm not, this isn't my usual workshop material, so I was a little nervous, so thank you for saying that.
Yes, you did great.
Thank you.
If you can do a high school workshop, you can do anything.
True.
I really feel that that is true.
I need to keep that in mind if I ever feel low on self-esteem. I've survived many high school workshops, so I can get through anything. All right, well, thank you again.
Yes, thank you.